All right, we're recorded.
All righty. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to ICABA's webinar on estate planning. Keith, Miles, and I, it's always our pleasure to come and partake of some information for you all and help you learn a little bit about the subject. We always like to start off by thanking our host, ICABA, International Career and Business Alliance, for providing such a phenomenal platform for us to disseminate this information. If you're not familiar with ICABA, it is an organization mainly based in Florida right now. They operate on a membership basis. They have fantastic resources for everyone, including these webinar series that Keith and I do, as well as many other platforms and ways to get the information out. I encourage everyone to check out ICABA World, ICABA World Community, and check out the information that's out there. Also, they have fantastic mastermind groups that allow you to explore information on various topics at your leisure, and to join those groups, again, just check out ICABA World Community. Again, we always like to thank them for providing this platform for us to get the information out.
And as Shannon said, mostly they're in Florida. They're also in Atlanta. So Shannon and I are part of the Atlanta Advisory Board. So if you're in Atlanta, we definitely would encourage you to join. But I know our CEO, Jerome Hutchinson, we call him Hutch, is certainly trying to expand nationally. So if you are in a location other than Georgia or Florida and are interested in maybe starting a chapter, I think is it 30 members to get a charter chapter?
Yes.
So if you are interested in your area getting a CABA chapter, definitely reach out and let us know, and we definitely would help you pursue that. This is a great organization, and hopefully when we can start getting together actually physically again, we can start doing some of the networking in person that it's known for. But right now, even on Zoom, it's a very beneficial organization.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we have a couple more people have joined us.
We're at double digits. I think we can.
Yeah, in the best interest of time, why don't we just go ahead and start?
All right. Let's get started.
All right. So I guess maybe we should introduce ourselves first.
Sure.
We just kind of jumped right in there and started talking.
We had the returnees, but yeah, we have a lot of new faces, so we could do that.
We do. I'll start. My name is Shannon Wilson, and I am an estate planning attorney here in the Metro Atlanta area. My firm is Legacy Legal, and it is always my honor and my pleasure to help individuals, thereby impacting their communities, which we're going to talk about tonight, through their estate planning needs.
And I'm Keith Miles. I'm also in the Atlanta metro area, and focused on estate planning, elder law, and a little bit of tax law, and a sole practitioner, and just excited about trying to pass this kind of information on to our community. So I always enjoyed. I think this is our 7th one. So Shannon and I have been doing this every month for the last 7 months. So we have a few more to go on our schedule. So hopefully we can keep going for a while, but it's been a pleasure working with her. So.
Yes, absolutely, Keith. Yeah, I can't believe we've already done 7. So we started in August, and we did some overviews of estate planning. We talked about the various aspects of estate planning, and this month we thought we would circle back to our roots and talk a little bit about how estate planning is impacted and what that looks like, especially in line with Black history. Next month, feel free to join us. Oh, by the way, we meet the 3rd Tuesday of every month at 7:00 p.m. Next month, we're going to be talking about heir property. And as we get into tonight's discussion, you'll hear a little bit more about what that is and how it impacts certain communities. So let's go into our topic, and we're going to be talking about, for the love of our people, estate planning from a Black history perspective. All right, so we should always start with telling you what estate planning is, because most people have a baseline knowledge of what estate planning is. And when I say baseline knowledge, most people have heard that there's a thing out there called a will. And yeah, Keith and I meet with people all of the time, and there is no shame in saying that is really all I know about estate planning. You would probably be, not probably, you would be with the majority if that was what you said. So I think, speaking for myself, that is one of the reasons why I practice estate planning law, because I think that the majority should know what it is, especially because it impacts all of us on uh, a multi-generational level. So what is estate planning? It is your opportunity and our opportunity to build a legacy. It is our opportunity to do what we need to do and should do for our families, for our loved ones, for our business partners, for our children, to build a legacy while we are living. The only way we can do that is by planning properly. And so estate planning is legacy building. It is also way more than just having a life insurance policy in place to provide for your burial. You know, so many times, especially in the African American community and communities of color, we will have a life insurance policy in place. We say, okay, I'm done. I got enough out. There's enough money to bury me. I know if we could raise our hands, everyone out here has probably heard somebody say that there's enough money in there to bury me. But estate planning involves way more than that.
So we're while putting mechanisms in place to make sure that you have impact on generations to come. We certainly want to take care of our children and spouse, but if we really plan correctly, we can plan for the grandchildren and the great grandchildren. And not everybody will be able to do that, but you actually can do that a lot easier than you think if you plan ahead. And we mentioned being more than life insurance, but even life insurance, it depends on how you handle it. Do you give it to someone outright, or do you give it to them in a trust and help them to manage it? So we'll talk about some things that we can just tweak a little bit. We're kind of doing some of those things already, but we just need to tweak it just a little bit to make it work. And I think I speak for Shannon. A lot of times when people say estate plan, they automatically think of death, right? So they're like, all right, well, I'm going to die, I got to be buried. But we also plan as estate planning attorneys for while you're alive, issues of incapacity. All right. Many people have probably people in their family who may have had dementia, Alzheimer's, but some other condition that didn't allow them, just simple old age, maybe just didn't allow them to make decisions anymore. And of course, if you have any health issues, advanced directives, we've heard of the classical vegetative state. Do you keep someone on life support or not? Those kind of decisions are part of your estate planning. So your will kicks in after you pass away, but we want to handle situations before that. And then if you don't have a will, you've probably heard the phrase, if you don't have a plan, the state has one for you. So each and every state is different. This area is a state-dominated area on the probate level, but on the tax level, you have a little bit of a federal area, but it's mostly state. So each time you move to another state, you need to familiarize yourself with that state's laws on how property passes. And of course, wealth planning, people think, oh, I don't have enough. And we'll talk about some of the reasons and misconceptions we have in our community. But whatever you have, you want to make sure it goes to whoever you want it to go to. So we'll talk about that.
Yeah. Also, ensuring that your legacy is properly created so that you can transfer those assets at death. So not only is estate planning the planning for incapacity, but it's also the planning for the disposition of your assets upon death. And it's also planning for generational wealth. One of my favorite family members once said that rich people, or no, how do you say it? Rich people plan for Saturday night. Wealthy people plan for 3 generations from now. So in estate planning, we like to plan for wealth. And what does that look like? It doesn't look like getting together for that GoFundMe or for what happens next week. It's what we put in place now and how it can impact generation after generation after generation. So let's go on and talk about misconceptions in the Black community about estate planning. Some of these are going to make some of you laugh. And if you are among the people who have said any of these things, just chalk it up to a chuckle and laugh with us on it, because believe me, you would not have said or heard anything that Keith and I don't hear on a daily basis. Number one, I don't have anything to pass down or anyone to pass it down to. So many people say that. And my response to that is always, if you have life, you have something to pass down. If you are living and breathing, you have something to pass down. If you have 3 pennies under the mattress, you have something to pass down.
And that estate planning is only for rich people. Of course, the first thought is, all right, how are you defining rich, right? So is there a number in your head? I'm sure we all have much more than we think we do. And I know for a fact that people will fight in terms of family members over amounts that you don't think are that much. So it means a lot to someone else. Even if it doesn't, you don't think you have a lot, someone else in your family will value it. And you definitely want to plan for it and not leave it up to chance.
Right. Nobody will fight over what I have. Well, don't leave that to, don't make it so that you give them an opportunity to do so. And there's always that phrase out there about one man's trash is another man's treasure. So sometimes people don't necessarily value the things that you may think you have monetarily, but they may have some sentimental attachment to the slightest thing that you would think nobody would care about. And there's somebody out there that probably does think very highly of that item or whatever it may be. So that's another misconception.
Another one, I'm single, so this is not for me, right? I don't have any children, I don't have any spouse, maybe the parents passed away, so they're just kind of like, it'll go wherever it goes, somebody will get it. But do you want the state to get it, or do you want maybe your church to get it, or your school, or your favorite organization? You can at least control where your property goes. So even if you're not thinking of the traditional beneficiaries, we want you to think deeper and further, especially our community. There are plenty of organizations that could benefit from people just taking that extra step.
Right, right. I'm only insert age here. This is not for me. Unless the age is under the age of 18, it does not apply. We often think I'm too young to do this. Well, everyone from the time they turn 18 should engage in estate planning. Now, do people's estates look different as they age, as they accumulate, as family structure changes? Absolutely. However, everyone from the time they turn 18 should engage in some estate planning.
And this is my favorite. I won't be here to see what happens, so it doesn't really matter to me. Some people, they don't like the topic. Let's be blunt. No one likes to think about it. It's not a pleasant thing. It's scary, and it's kind of avoidance of it. But there are other people who literally figure whatever they get is more than they had before. Let them work it out. I don't need to take those steps. But we hopefully, after going through this, will implore you to really have a plan and communicate that plan to others so everyone knows what it is.
Right, right. The next one, all I need is enough life insurance for my kids to bury me. We already talked about that. And so many times that's all people think that they need in place. But even that now could not be enough. And later on, we're going to talk about some examples where that was the case and it ended up not being enough. And without proper full estate planning on top of that life insurance, it is not going to cover. It's going to leave holes, it's going to leave gaps, and it's going to not work for a plan. And then my all-time favorite, I'm not doing that. If I write a will today, I'll die tomorrow. Can't tell you how superstitious we, especially we as a people, are. And so many times people get all in their feelings and in their head about planning an estate instead of just doing it.
Yeah,
and really the funny part about that is, well, we're all going to die. We're going to throw a lot of statistics at you all tonight. All of us are going to die. So whether you write the will or plan your estate today or tomorrow, that's going to be the case at some point. Just none of us know the day nor the hour.
Yeah, so of course, those who fail to, what's it? If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So not doing so could be disastrous. And this is really, we put this slide together to show you that even though we're talking about our community, this is really a general problem across all communities. Only 42% of American adults have wills. It's not a pleasant topic. People don't like to do it. They procrastinate. It's not just us. Okay. But even saying that, that doesn't make it okay. All right. And then we're going to go to next. We have higher percentages. So 70% of us have no will or estate plan. So even if we were at 42%, that's still too high, but we're even higher than that. So we don't have the resources, as many of you know, that some of the other communities do in terms of assets and things. So we need to really make sure that we are together with our plans. And we're going to have some data to talk about different aspects. So hopefully, as we said, you'll see why this topic for this evening is so critical after we go through all these steps.
Right. 70%. That means only 1 in 3 people plan their estate. That's quite disheartening. So historically, data speaking, how did African Americans come to the United States? And we could probably do an entire course on this, but we all know that it was part of the slave trade. And between 1820 and 1860 is when the Deep South, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, were infiltrated with slaves.
And we can't underestimate the psychology of this. We know that sometimes other people say to us, why don't you just do this? Why don't you just do that? You pick yourself up by the bootstrap. We know we have a unique history in this country. So we can't ignore that. But at the same time, we have to deal with that and still go forward, because we have a lot of things that are changing in this country. And as we all know, we'll talk about some of the things with COVID and other things. So we have a lot of things going on that we can't deny, but we also have to work through.
Right. And something we forgot to mention when we started, if anyone has any questions throughout this, feel free to write them in the chat window, and we will address questions as we go. We'll also leaving some time at the end for Q&A. So, is it really history? Not really. And some of these statistics are about to show you that no, it's not historical, because some of them will show you that we have not really come too much further from 1860 to 2021. And so what do we consider when we're talking about estate planning and historical data among African Americans, among people of color in the United States? So there are essentially 5 factors, one of which only crept up in the last year, but it is significantly jarring when we look at the numbers. But there's 5 factors that we should consider when we look at this, and what goes into estate planning and what contributes to especially our people not engaging in estate planning. One is that there is a significant wealth gap in the United States, not only between people of color, but between white people, Asian people, like all of the different ethnicities have different wealth gaps. Black people being the largest gap. Also, housing and property. We don't tend to own our homes, and we don't keep our land in the family, therefore causing another huge disparity that certainly impacts estate planning. The third is our family structures. And there are some statistics that show why our family structures have been impacted the way they have, and what that does to generations, what that does to creating harmony, what that does to creating environments that will foster estate planning and lead us to instill in one another the importance of it. Another is education. And then we're going to talk about COVID and how that has absolutely impacted estate planning.
And if I think about these 5 topics, the first 4, I think historically we've been talking all along about our history in this country and all the things that we've had, Jim Crow, discrimination, everything. And then COVID just hit everybody at the same time out of nowhere. So some of these four things will always be there, but now we have this extra item that's kind of dominating the moment. But none of these other things have gone away either. And COVID is exasperating the things that we've already been dealing with all this time. So it's a really great time to have this discussion of how we are going to, as a people, get through this time.
Right. All right. So we're going to start by talking about the wealth gap. And historically speaking, Black people have earned less. When we think about income, when we talk about our employment, we have earned less than our counterparts. The median net worth for a Black household in 2016, and most of these numbers are based on 2016 because that is when the statistics from the last census came out. Some of these numbers, all of these numbers come out of a June 2020 article that discussed the census and what the numbers look like. So median net worth of a Black household in 2016 was $17,150.
So we're talking about a tenth of the median net worth of a white family, 171,000. And this is one of those numbers that you have to look at as a Black person in this country and think historically of all the generations that did not get the opportunity to acquire things from discrimination, the opportunity to pass things down. So this number is not just about talent or drive and opportunity. There are some historical factors here that are present underneath these numbers, but it still affects our estate planning. So we have to, like I said, we have to really take care of having plans, because we are fighting that result of all these methods to keep us in this situation.
Right.
So 8.7% is the median. Black household had 8.7% of the wealth of a white household, and that is, something that is. We have techniques that are like, we hear about affirmative action and other things, that government contracts and other things, but I think this is still jarring that we are still at this level after all that movement, civil rights, affirmative action, contracts, and we are still struggling to gain ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The next one, 44.3%, is the amount that net worth fell among Black people between 2007 and 2013. 44.3%. That means when we should be climbing in a critical time, our net worth dropped, and that widened the gap during that time period. And that kind of goes in hand with the next one, 36%. Only 36% of us have money in the stock market. So, and Gallup, again, another fantastic organization that does all kinds of polling, but only 36% of us engage in the stock market. Personally, I don't know what that comes from. Maybe it comes from one of the next topics we're going to talk about, education. We just don't know how, we don't know why, we don't understand it, so we're not going to get involved with it. It also goes to our levels of superstition that we typically have as a people.
I'm also thinking, Shannon, it might be the kind of jobs, maybe we don't have the corporate job with that kind of 401k built up, that design savings program, and that might be some kind of structural employment numbers that are behind that. We might be more entrepreneurial, but yet we may not have these retirement plans set up to do that kind of investment.
Right, and that goes to the next one. 46% of us, only 46% have some sort of retirement wealth or retirement planning established. So given those numbers, the wealth gap is going to continue to widen. So what do we do? And we're going to talk about why all of these things directly impact the reasoning for why everyone should get involve themselves in planning your estate, because these numbers and wealth is what we're trying to leave for generations. Okay, there's different levels of wealth, but we have to start somewhere. And if we're always starting at the bottom of the barrel, then we're never going to even get to the middle of the barrel. So it's one step at a time. And as long as we start taking those steps, we can gradually diminish that gap.
I wanted to add with the retirement, this is a scary number because we always hear that there's like a three-prong approach. You got your Social Security, your retirement savings, and then the pension, right? And then pensions are a lot of times going away now, so you got to go to 401k. And then if we don't have our Social Security, we're hearing that's supposed to run out. And always the question is that going to last? So we have to really focus on saving for our own retirement and investing in stock market. This is definitely an area where we need to focus. And that's not really an estate planning attorney. We need the financial advisors. Shannon tell you, estate planning, we didn't say this earlier, is about a team. So, the estate planning attorney, your CPA, your tax professional, your insurance, your investment professional, all of them together are what you really need to get a comprehensive plan. Because I know Shannon and I, we have our areas of expertise, but we're not going to probably be able to tell you what things you need to invest in and other things to, we'll just tell you need to do it. And if you need to pay it to the trust, we can draft a trust that will handle the funds if you pay it to the trust and other things. But you need a bunch of professionals that will help you have the complete picture.
Yeah, I like to think about it like a highway. So the highway of life has different lanes. And one of those lanes that's going to get you to that legacy is estate planning. Another one of those lanes is financial planning. Another one of those lanes is insurance planning. Another one is tax planning. And as long as all of those lanes are moving in the same direction, you will get to that comprehensive plan that covers everything. But when somebody veers over into the wrong lane and you get the wrong information, that's where wrecks happen. If any of you are here in Metro Atlanta, I'm preaching to the choir. Y'all see it all day, every day, right? Somebody veers in the wrong lane and now we have a pileup. And so just like Keith said, we all work together to make sure that our clients have the most comprehensive plan and that their highway is going in the direction that they want so that their legacy at the end of that road looks the way they want it to look. All right, so the wealth gap, again, it is staggering statistics on how that wealth gap occurred. Another thing that we need to take into consideration is housing and property. Two different things, but they are completely intertwined. And I'm going to start by talking about the property aspect of it. When I say property, I'm talking about real property, which is land. All right, now statistically speaking, I don't know what the amount of land is that is currently developed, but I do know that we are not going to have any more land on this here earth. So giving away land is not the way to keep it in the family, because we're not going to have any more that we can get later. So air property is something, especially in areas where outside of a metropolitan area, there's rural areas, and a lot of rural areas as well as metropolitan areas have a lot of air property. And what air property is when ownership, and when I say ownership, I'm talking about that deed, that piece of paper that attaches a person or people to a piece of property. When the names on that, everyone's name on there, and all of those people are now deceased, that property becomes air property because there is not a living person listed on that document. And so in order to do anything to transfer it, then say, for instance, there were 4 names on it and all 4 of them passed away, leaving 10 children each. Now, rather than that property being owned by 4 people, now it is potentially owned by 40. Is that right, math? Yeah, 40 people. Because when a person passes away, if their name is on the deed, then it passes to their descendants, their heirs. That's what makes it air property. So you can imagine that it was hard to transfer that property with 4 people, now complicate that by 10. And all 10 people have to agree on it, or all 10 people have to, sign on the dotted line. Everyone has to be in agreement. And, it's hard enough to get 2 people to decide things a lot of times, much less 10 people or 40 people. And now we're talking about 2 and 3 generations down the line. So heir property, again, it's a default ownership where there is no longer a living person's name on the deed.
And I wanted to mention, Shannon mentioned that we're going to have a seminar next month, and we're going to cover this in more depth. So we're just kind of giving you an overhead. But really, the reason why this happens a lot of times is that when someone passes away, we don't go to the courthouse and do the proper steps of estate administration. Okay, let me actually, whether there's a will or not, let me just go to the court, get this done formally so that now we can actually pass title. The court would actually pass the title so that way we know who owns it. But what happens is, well, the bill's still coming, the tax bill's coming, just pay the taxes on the property, pay whatever on a day-to-day basis, and people are living there without actually having title. And that's when people start passing away, like Shannon said, and then it's just been one of those things, the property is in the family, but the name on the property might be someone who was passed away 40 years ago because people are just paying the taxes. So we definitely want to emphasize that there is a reason you need to go to court after someone passes. If nothing else, even if there's nothing that you really have a value beyond the land, you need to just pass that title properly.
Right, right. We as a people so often say, well, grandma told me I could live there as long as I want. Okay. And now it's 3 generations later and somebody's paying the taxes. Inevitably, I don't know, Keith, about you, but inevitably, the person that's paying the property taxes is not the person that's actually living there. And when that person that's paying gets tired of paying, that's when the drama occurs. I've been paying these taxes all these years and you're living there free.
Right.
Okay, well, while we are living, while we are able, we have mechanisms to ensure that that doesn't happen. We have enough forces against us as a people. let's not let property be another means of infighting among ourselves. So without clear title, you can't transfer that property. You can't sell it. You can't even pass it on to somebody else upon your death because it's got to be clear at the top. So you can't even say, this is what I want to happen with my 1/3 interest if no one else has cleared up your 1/3 interest and you really don't think you had a 1/3, but now you have actually a 1/18 interest or something like that. So there's nothing you can do about it. And also, this is where companies and organizations and municipalities come in, and they will sell that property right from under the family. And usually, again, I wish I had a statistic for this, but usually the family is not going to get the market value for that property because they are sitting, they're watching, they know that, they check the deeds and they know that there's not a living person's name on there. It's heir property. And don't let it be that the extra bad part about it is what Keith was talking about, the property taxes. When those property taxes are no longer being paid, then the county can put a lien on it. And so now no one can do anything with it. Nobody's selling it. Nobody's living there. The county has a lien on it and it's just sitting there. Whereas we could take that property, develop it. We could take that property, say there's a house on it, turn it into an income producing property for that family. This is how other people do it. Turn it into an income producing opportunity for that family, like a rental property. And now children and great grandchildren and great great grandchildren can go to college on that property that was passed down from one generation to the next. So we lose out on our opportunities when it comes to leaving an estate by failing to properly delineate our property and housing. So I said property and housing are 2 different things. Now let's talk about home ownership.
We have 44% of blacks owning their homes compared to whites. And I think this ties into some of what we're talking about. Like Shannon said, if I'm not leaving, not having land and homes, I'm not leaving them to the next generation, then the next generation is pretty much starting from the position of having to get their credit together, get their money together to buy something that could have been left to them. Someone else might have that property left to them. And now also if I'm renting instead of owning, if I pass away, I don't have a piece of property to leave to the next generation because I was renting when I passed. That no land interest is there. And then the other thing too, financially, if I'm paying a mortgage or paying rent, that's less money I have to invest in the stock market, business, other things. So if I can leave my children a house where they don't have to do any mortgage or rent, that frees them up to use their funds in other purposes that can enrich the generations to come. So we have to see this as a chain of a ripple effect. Once you don't have that first level or you lose that land, other people can't do the things that they could have done.
Right, right. And I want to go circle back to something that you were saying about having clear title. And this goes to the land itself, and the property goes to housing, because with that clear title on that property, you can use that property as collateral to get a loan for a house. Without that clear title, you can't even use it as collateral for a loan. So the cycle of not having therefore perpetuates itself. So again, we have to stop that cycle.
And I want to add one thing. I mean, you mentioned the property taxes. I know there's a big thing out now where people look on, oh, tax liens, you can get houses for pennies on the dollar. Go to the courthouse on whatever morning, 9 a.m. on Tuesday mornings, and they're reading up. That's a lot of us that are losing those homes. All right, so there's, this is capitalist. We understand this is America, so everyone has the opportunity to make money, but understand that's a lot of what's going on the back end is those property taxes aren't being paid and that land is being lost. We are probably on the end of that, who's having it happen, the victims of that.
Right, right. All right, so that's the housing and the property. We talked about the wealth gap. We've talked about housing and property. Another issue that impacts Black people, people of color.
A couple of questions. I didn't even see it before, so.
Let's see here. Questions.
If you have judgments, can you still do a trust and protect your assets? I'm going to take that. There's an area of law called asset protection. And if you try to transfer property out of your name when you know that you have a judgment, it used to be called a fraudulent conveyance. Now they call it avoidable conveyance, or whatever they want to call it. But there's a time frame of, first of all, if you know you have something, a judgment, and you try to transfer property, it could be undone. So you can set it up, but it's subject to a court, someone going to court and undoing it. So to answer the question, can you still do it? Yes. Protect your assets? Probably no, because they're going to probably go to court and say, okay, well, what's the date that trust was established? Oh, the judgment was done before that. We know that this person was doing this to transfer funds. And certain states have different amount of time that you can do it. So I think Georgia is 4 years. Other states, they have a little chart of asset protection trust states. So states like Nevada are like 1 year. And so they're kind of, the states are kind of marketing themselves as asset protection states, and they change that time frame. But in general, you won't be able to do it and protect your assets if you already have judgments.
Right, and that goes for civil judgments as well as bankruptcy. So for instance, even with bankruptcy, when there are certain assets that you can protect or shelter in a bankruptcy, but say for instance, you pay certain creditors and things before you file that bankruptcy, there's also time frames on that where that creditor can be required to pay that money back, put it back into the bank or wherever it was being housed. And so it looks like you still owe. So yeah, that is not a great idea to try to do that, because you could
And I
come
want to
out
add one
really
thing. I'm not a bankruptcy lawyer, but I'm going to just tell you this just so you guys know. All right, I've mentioned the states have like a 4-year rule of fraudulent conveyance, but if you file bankruptcy, they added a 10-year super look back. So there have been cases where someone satisfied their state rule, and it might have been 5 years and they were protected by the state, and then they went and filed bankruptcy, and then the bankruptcy trustee could look back 10 years and started undoing some stuff, trusts from 10 years ago. So just be careful with bankruptcy.
Absolutely. Or with anyone trying to shelter assets and trying to get around a judgment. The second question, after sitting down with an attorney, how long before the trust will be put in place? Well, that depends on the time frame, and that also depends on the type of trust that is going into effect and how that particular attorney works. Everyone that's on here will have both Keith and I's information at the end of this, so feel free to contact either one of us and we can walk you through our processes.
Okay.
All right. So
let's.
Yeah, I'm gonna mark those as answered. All right, so let's see, family structure. So essentially, estate planning is about our families and about maintaining for legacies for our families. So there is not a more rooted element to estate planning than family and what that looks like. What we do know is that in the 80s and 90s, there were certain things that impacted the 1980s and 1990s that impacted marriage among Black people. A lot of that had to do with the war on drugs. It had to do with the incarceration rates for our men, and it had to do with them being in prison, therefore further severing the family structure. When it comes to estate planning, that sever in the family structure is tied to everything else that we talked about. It goes to that wealth gap. It goes to that property. It goes to education. It's going to go to everything that we talk about in this. And so the family structure and the family unit and what that looks like is directly impacted by estate planning. Marriage has its benefits when it comes to estate planning. It has its benefits when it comes to tax planning, which is also intricately tied to estate planning. But again, without some of those benefits of marriage, your estate plan is compromised. And later on, we're going to talk about a particular celebrity that this happened to. So traditionally, we know that women are the more nurturing, are the more prevalent to be the caregivers. With that, we women, and I can say we, I'm in this number two, we are nurturers, we are caregivers. So we will give to our families and forsake our own care. So we end up with health issues of our own. And again, the cycle perpetuates, right? So that also impacts estate plans and what that looks like. We are often not in the workplace in the same traditional way. So it's easier for a woman to say, oh, well, okay, I will quit my job and help care for my grandmother. Okay, that's fantastic. But then when grandma passes away or something else occurs, then we're left behind the power curve. And without proper estate planning, that can become a financial burden on the entire family. And so with good estate planning, we can alleviate that burden, that financial burden that goes into helping care for a family member. Long-term care costs can eat up what is in any estate.
We're going to take the last two here. We have the child support. I'm going to take that first. We're looking at this effect on Black marriage and the numbers low. So if you're not married and get divorced, now one household is paying funds to another. So that might be a situation where if they had stayed married, those funds could have been invested more for the unit and things can grow. But now we have a situation where there's, maybe now two households that are struggling, right? And that repeats itself across our communities. And we have an issue in particular. We have special needs stigma. We don't really talk about a lot of times those family members that may have some disabilities, mental health issues, other things that is just kind of that person's just, you know, around without proper care, planning for that person. We may not be aware that if we leave property to someone in a situation where they have government benefits, they may lose their benefits, right? So I might be well-intentioned. I have a niece or a nephew that I say, oh, I'm going to leave my 401k to help them out because they're autistic and have some money for them for the rest of their lives, but you don't do it in the proper fashion. You leave it to them directly, they lose their benefits. Now to get back on the benefits, they have to spend down all the money you gave them. If you did it in a slightly different way, we have certain trusts that are designed, special needs trusts, supplemental needs trusts. You do the same asset in a different manner. The method, the form matters in this area, and then you can leave them as much money as you want and not affect their benefits. So we actually have after the air property, the month after, we have a special needs seminar, a webinar. So we encourage you for the next 2 months to come join us, because we're going to cover some of these topics that you're not probably going to hear about in our community, because we definitely need to address some of these issues with the special needs, because like Shannon said, you know, care, long-term care is not just for the elderly. Long-term care is a lot of times for a disabled child or adult that's going to be, you know, you could be 22. I have a specialty in brain injuries, and a lot of them are 20s, 30s, 40s, and they're looking at being on care for many, many years. And like Shannon said, that might be that parent, and particularly a mother or a sister or aunt or whatever, that's going to take care of them, and you're impacting multiple people in the family and their economic ability to generate funds for many, many years.
Right. Yeah, I want to also circle back to the child support obligation. Many courts now, family law courts, are requiring, if a parent has a child support obligation on them, they are requiring that person to have a life insurance policy in place that would cover that child support should they pass away while that child is still a minor. Because child support obligations do not die with you.
And I'm one of those, I raise my hand on that one.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a policy that is, I have to keep in effect.
Absolutely.
My daughter is 8. So that policy will be in effect for at least 10 more years.
10 more years, right. And that's to protect the legacy. That's to protect the inheritance of that child, because a child support obligation is to support that child while that parent is living. Well, if that parent is no longer here, that child still needs that financial support. So that's why courts are requiring non-custodial or child support obligated parents to have a life insurance policy in place. Is that enough, and is that estate planning? No, but it is certainly a start, and it certainly impacts some communities more than others.
Shannon, we have a question. We'll address it in the chat.
All right, question in the chat.
It says, if you have a judgment and have joint property with someone else, can the courts make you sell your part to pay the debt? And there's 2 parts to that. If you have the standard joint tenants with right of survivorship, one of the tenants has an issue, so you got a judgment from a creditor, or you have tax problems. One of those people's issues can be attached to that property, and you're subject to having your property seized based on someone else's actions. But, there are some states that have a special form of ownership called tenants by the entirety.
Right.
And if that's only for married couples, and if you have a debt that's only for one of the spouses and not both of the spouses, then you can't attach that property that only one of the spouses has. So you have to go into the details on that. But generally, that's part of the issue with putting property in your name and someone else's. We see this a lot in the elderly community, where they try to put a child's name mom or dad has property. So let me add my kid's name to the property to make it easier for the child to handle it. But if that child has debts and other things going on, you could expose that property to their debts.
Right. Excellent. Boy, people are asking great questions tonight, Keith.
Yes.
All right, so we talked about the family structure. We talked about the wealth gap. We talked about the wealth gap. Now let's talk about education. And this, again, all of these things are tied, tied together. And this chart talks about the weekly wages by education when it comes to Black people and everyone else as a whole. What I want to draw the most attention to is actually not on the chart itself, but it's in all of these words over here, which basically says, I want to see if I can highlight it. Nope, I couldn't highlight it. But only a third of Black men who enter college graduate in 6 years. That is nearly half the rate of white men, according to the data. A third graduate. And then you take that and further complicate it. Only a third graduate, but African-American students are more likely than whites to have student loan debt when they graduate. Why are we more likely? Because we don't have our estates being planned, creating ways to pay for college for generations that others have. So what that does is that puts that financial burden on the student to pay for college, and then they drop out because they can't pay for college because they either can't get that student loan by themselves, or, you know, even parents are hesitant to take out a parent loan for that student to go to school because they're still paying off their own student loans. And so again, it's that I feel like we're in a hamster wheel, you know. So the educational aspect of it absolutely impacts wages. It impacts our economy. It impacts our ability to earn, which impacts our ability to have anything to leave a legacy with.
And also with this, I was thinking back to my childhood. You know, it was kind of that psychology put on you. All right, you have to go to college to get a good job. And then, you know, as I got older, I was like, man, I could have probably have gone to a cheaper place, or maybe gone to technical school and gotten a trade or something like that. So I think that's part of our story we need to talk to each other about is, do we need to go a certain route in order to be successful? We may, especially with technology, there may be certificates, trade schools, and other things that give us the same benefits without taking on that debt. So we may need to overcome some of our historical bent and really start to examine what we're telling our youth of how to go about their path.
Absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of financial advisors now will tell you, don't spend all that money on a college education if that child doesn't even want to do what a college education is going to afford them the opportunity to do. If they can go to trade school for a fraction of the cost and be happier, make more money and everything else, go to trade school. You know, if you can go to a junior college and get those credits out of the way and pay a fraction of the price, do so. If you can get the same education that you can get on one side of the country, as opposed to getting that same education for a fraction of the price right here or wherever you are, then do it. There's scholarship opportunities. There's all kinds of things that we just often overlook because we think, well, I can't afford it.
And Shannon, we have another question in the chat, or Q&A.
Let me see here. What is this Q&A? If you do a homestead, will that protect your property from judgments? Homestead exemption does not protect you from judgments. It protects you from certain taxes on that home.
Well, there is a, and I think that's what the person talking about on the asset protection side. There are certain exemptions that certain states have, but they're not anywhere near the value. I think Georgia's like $5,000. And but now there are certain states, like I mentioned, those states that have the asset protection trust where they're competing. Texas and Florida have homestead exemptions that will protect you in those particular states because they're designing themselves as asset protection states. That's why O.J. Simpson moved from California to Florida and did all this stuff. So limited protection in certain states. Most states, like Shannon said, you're not going to have that protection. And homestead a lot of times is a tax aspect rather than a property asset protection.
Right. All right, let's see here. So the education, essentially that leaves us behind the power curve as well. Now let's talk about COVID, because that is something that swept in here in 2020, and all of these other aspects that we just talked about were already out there. They're already pervading the community, and now we have yet another something piled on top that makes the impact of all of those even worse. So COVID impacted Black people, African Americans across the board significantly more than anyone else. 16.8% is the number of Black workers who lost their jobs as of May 2020. COVID, really, we didn't even get under those restrictions until March. 2 months in, less than 2 months in, 16.8% had become jobless as an impact of COVID.
That second one, I want to make sure, is this 28% that had to pay, who couldn't pay?
That couldn't pay their mortgage payment in May, 28%. Right. Okay, and now if we take that and we add on to the fact that 28% of Black homeowners couldn't pay their mortgage, and we are also 40% less likely to own a home. Now we see those statistics all in the, I'm thinking about like being in an ocean, right? We'll never get from under that water.
And this kind of thing goes to not having enough of a reserve. If you were left an inheritance and you didn't, maybe you lost your job, but okay, if I have $250,000 that mom or dad left me, I can make my mortgage payments for a little while. But if we don't have that situation, we go under. And so anytime we don't have any kind of reserve, that's a crisis. We always had that saying before growing up, America gets a sneezes, Black America gets a cold. So what is it when white America gets COVID, right? So if a sneeze gives us a cold, what does COVID give us, right? So it could take us out if we're really not, and we don't know how long this is going to last. We hoped, I think 2021, everyone's like, 2021 is coming, and then you realize this thing's still going on. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot of fear here. So hopefully we can weather this. And the 2 out of 5 is the share of Black businesses that were forced to close in April 2020 because of the pandemic. And Shannon said right away, like as soon as it happened, 40%, we just went down. And I think part of that is too the type of businesses that we do have. A lot of us have sole proprietorships with one-person businesses. So if we are basically lifestyle businesses and we don't have the customers, we don't have the base of business, if we get sick ourselves, then there's no one to run that business. So our business structure needs to be looked at, and maybe we start to look at how we form our business. Maybe we start grouping together and not go solo all the time, and maybe we start forming partnerships and other things to make ourselves stronger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I look at that, I think about a friend of mine who, her grandmother had life insurance. Her grandmother also had a will. She was one of 10 grandchildren, and grandma had enough life insurance to bury her, right? Just like many of us. But then she also left each of her 10 grandchildren $1,000 each. 9 of the 10 grandchildren, their $1,000 was gone by the next week. My friend took her, she invested her, she started her own business, and now 10, 15 years later, about 12 years later, she has a multi-million-dollar business from that $1,000 inheritance that grandma left her. And so it's taking those things and using them wisely. So what does everything we've talked about have to do with estate planning? And is it really historical? The answer to that is no, it is not historical. Why? Because we are still in it. We are still in it. And Keith and I were talking about this definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. If we continue to do the same thing over and over again with regard to our estate planning or lack thereof, we are always going to have the same results. So let's look at the questions. Is that what you're about to say?
Yes. I see a question from my dude from college. That's my man, Eric Robinson. So I give him a shout out. If you and your spouse executed a will years ago while living in a different state, will it still be applicable if you have since moved to a different state? So the short answer is yes, the will would be valid. Okay, so it would be recognized as long as it met the criteria of whatever that state said it needed to have witnesses, notary, whatever it needed to do. You might hopefully have a self-proving affidavit, or else you might need to drag some witnesses in there and get interrogatories, but that's estate planning stuff. But the question that goes beyond whether the will could be applicable is how does it function? Will it function in the exact same way? So we in Georgia, we don't have any spousal protection like other states do. So we don't. Other states have a called right of elective share. So if the spouse is left out of the will, if I'm the husband and I leave everything to my children, I'm mad at my spouse, and just leave everything to my children and leave my spouse out. Especially if it was a second marriage, the spouse can elect against my will in many states and say, okay, I'm supposed to get a minimum share, and the state has some laws set up to protect him or her. But in other states, that might be a different level. Some states might be a third, some states might be less. Some states like Georgia might not be anything. So your will may be valid, but it may not have the same exact effect. So hopefully that answered your question.
Right. And another thing, it doesn't hurt when you move to revisit your will. I always talk about estate planning is a fluid thing. It is not a one and done thing. So as circumstances change, as lifestyles change, as finances change, as family structures change, as you move, those are always excellent opportunities to revisit your plan, right? Because what was valid in one place may not actually work for what you want it to do now that you're at a level, age, stage, or level. And so revisiting things is always a good idea. And I always encourage people, revisit it. Anytime you have a life-changing event, that is a time to revisit your plan, just to make sure that what you intended then still applies now. Whether that means you've moved from one state to another, or your family structure has changed, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and we'll talk about, we'll get to the thing with Kobe later, but this is the same kind of thing. If you have that old will, you may have had less kids then, and you may not have named the kid, and you may not have certain language in there that adds the new kid. So you definitely want to check things if it's been a while, and then also check the people, because you may have had people serving in certain roles. I want my executor to be this, my trustee to be that, and then maybe you had a falling out with that person, or maybe that person is no longer alive. You want to make sure you're familiar with who's serving in what roles also. So beyond the will being valid, make sure it actually does what you want it to do at this point in your life.
Right, because your estate planning not only covers you, but it covers all of those people that you're naming in your documents, especially whether they're serving in a fiduciary capacity or they're a beneficiary. So you should always revisit when there's changes in other people that are touched by your plan's lives as well. I will throw this example out there real quick. I once had a client, she's still a client, who was not married, had no children. She was leaving everything to her nephew, and her nephew messed up, and he ended up on serving a life sentence. So when I checked on her to say, hey, has anything changed? Do we need to make any updates to your plan? She says, I'm not really sure, but my nephew that I left everything to, she even named him as her power of attorney and everything. He's serving a life sentence now. Do you think I need to change my documents? Absolutely. And so, sometimes things happen and we think about how it impacts large picture things, but we tend to think about our estate plans as something small instead of something large that impacts so many things in life. So the second question on here, Keith, is so California, as an example of homestead, would mean the only protection would be from taxes owed. I'm going to let you address that since you were talking about the tax portion of homestead.
Let's I want to talk about two things. This is very state specific. So I mentioned Texas and Florida. I don't know California's rules. So I know Texas and Florida always stood out as having an unlimited homestead if you met their criteria. I don't know what California's rules are. But then the second part of that question is from taxes. So even when I'm talking a lot of times about exemptions, that's going to apply usually to creditors and judgment creditors and things. They usually carve out exceptions for the IRS. So even that question where I mentioned tenants by the entirety, where the spouses have protection if only one spouse, they still carved out an exception for the IRS liens. So usually the IRS is going to get theirs, and we kind of knew that before. You just kind of, IRS is going to get theirs. So I would say generally, I don't know what California does, but the IRS is going to get theirs. So don't plan on, and if you owe those taxes, they're going to come after you.
Right.
And I'm assuming the state of California will get theirs too for their taxes.
Right. All right. So why, given everything we talked about, why should Black people engage in estate planning? And this is a lot of words on the screen, and in the interest of time, I'm going to run through them. I'll start with the wealth gap, and then Keith, I'll let you take housing, and we can just toggle back and forth like we do so well. So the wealth gap, why should Black people engage in estate planning? Because earning money just by itself without passing it down does not allow us to close that wealth gap. Effective estate planning allows us to close that gap. It allows us to make the money, create the money, protect it, and properly transfer it through estate planning. The only way it can be properly transferred from one generation to the next, from one person to the next, is through estate planning. That's the only way we can close that wealth gap. Otherwise, if that gap continues, we have to always start from scratch, generation after generation after generation.
And we talked about the land and property and the air property. We mentioned those land being lost. If you're able to pass down a home to someone, they have it rent-free, mortgage-free. Now you can have money to do other things, build your generational wealth, start a business, invest. And then some of those things at the bottom, we mentioned, kind of talked passing. If you have certain forms of ownership, which we will talk about, I'll kind of pass right now because we're going to talk about air property on our next webinar. And I want you to come back. Hopefully, we can talk to you about some of the details of those three things at the bottom there. And we need to understand how property is owned. It's not just having the property. You have to understand how it's owned. Certain things pass through probate. Certain things don't. Certain things protect you in asset protection. Certain methods don't. So you need to know.
Right. And with that is something that we left off, but just like knowing how property is owned, we also need to know how structuring your business can impact your estate. And so also taking that into consideration. Family structure and harmony. People fight over the funniest things sometimes. It doesn't have to be money. It can be a piece of paper that a certain note was written on. Items are just as important to some people as monetary money items are. And so the only way we can avoid those arguments, well, some families, they're never going to be avoided, but as a general rule, if you plan your estate, that can end that fighting before it even starts. And I'll go ahead and re-mention what I was talking about earlier. Imagine what somebody can do with an inheritance when it comes to family structure, setting up that family for generations rather than, again, kind of like I talked about on the wealth gap, having to constantly reinvent the wheel.
In education, we talked about number one, try to reduce dependence on student loans. We know those loans are crushing, and if those loans stay, they affect your ability to get some of these houses, right? You go apply for a house, and they factor in what your student loan payment is. You may not qualify for a house, or may not qualify for the type of house you want. And we have a lot of opportunity probably now, especially with the changing economy, to have good paying jobs or even be entrepreneurial with methods without going through student loan route if we really investigate our different options. And I don't know about you, but you always feel that if you educate one or two members of the family, they can start educating others at home and in their family. So even if you don't get that formal necessary degree, if I have an elder or sibling who's teaching me what they're learning, now I'm ahead of the game and I maybe avoid certain mistakes and things. So we can provide resources, not only financial, but mental, spiritual to our other family members as we learn. We can do better, know better, do better, right? So
Right. That's right. When we know better, we do better. And then COVID. If we have learned nothing else from COVID, it is to make sure you have your affairs in order. And so what does that look like? That looks like protecting your spouse. That looks like protecting your children, protecting your business interests, protecting anything that has your name associated with it and is going to become part of your estate if something happens to you, or will be impacted if you become incapacitated. Making sure everything is in order for those things. Check your benefits, check your insurance policies, check all of your accounts. Make sure that you don't have somebody on there that has predeceased you, meaning they died before you. Checking those insurance benefits. Some people have a life insurance at work. Well, what if you no longer work there? And now you don't have that insurance policy, or it doesn't even have to be life insurance, any of those benefits that you had at an employer. And what happens if tomorrow that's not your employer? How are those benefits going to be impacted? And then anything that you have a beneficiary designation on, meaning it's a policy that says, if something happens to me, this is where that goes. Revisit those, check them, make sure everything is in line, not only for yourself, but for the people that you would leave behind if you became incapacitated or upon death. All too often, we as a people fail to plan. Everyone on this screen we see here failed to plan, with the exception of Aretha, and we'll get to her. I'm just going to quick high level look at these people, each of them individually. Chadwick Boseman, we know he passed away a couple of months ago without a last will and testament in place after having gone through 4 years of cancer. He knew that he was in failing health, yet he failed to put a will in place, leaving a almost newlywed wife and his family. Prince, I still think, just because I'm a Prince fan and because I know how savvy of a business person he was, I still think Prince had a will out there somewhere. I think it's somewhere in the coffers of Paisley Park. But he died without a will in place. James Brown, since we're here in Georgia, we can, I don't know if any of you are also in Georgia, but there's that connection where James Brown died without a will, and they didn't even bury him for, I believe it was years, right? Because he didn't have a will. Aretha, originally it was thought that she passed away without a last will and testament in place, having left 4 adult sons, one of whom had special needs, like we were talking about earlier, is going to need to be cared for the rest of his life. Later, it was determined that she left not 1 will, but she had 3 handwritten wills. In some states, those are valid, depending on your state's laws when it comes to what is a valid will. So she left 3 wills. They did not contradict one another, but they didn't say the same thing. So now they had to halt everything that was going on and figure that out. Bob Marley, people are still fighting over his estate, and I think Bob Marley died 40 years ago. Martin Luther King Jr. passed away without having left a last will and testament. His family should have his Bible. Instead, it's at the Smithsonian because he died without a will, therefore opening his estate to the state. And since he was a national figure, that opened it further to the federal government. His home that he grew up in here in Georgia is now owned by the National Park Service. So not having a last will and testament in place. Sam Cooke, Keith and I were talking about the movie, the One Night in Miami. He died without a will in place. And so having the documents in place, and sometimes it is more than a will, and we'll see that on the next two people we're talking about. Keith, do you want to add anything to all of these?
No, you covered them well.
Or we plan, but we leave things open, where sometimes it's not intentional, kind of like Keith was saying earlier, where we can have the best intentions in how we plan for people and thinking we're covering them, but our failure to properly have a comprehensive estate plan in place leaves holes, leaves gaps, and that leaves our loved ones vulnerable. Kobe Bryant had a trust in place, a fantastic trust in place. However, he and his wife Vanessa put that trust in place prior to the birth of their last daughter. So Vanessa Bryant, with all of Kobe's millions and all of his foundations and his plan, she had to actually petition the court, ask the court for permission to change their trust to now name youngest baby girl so that she would not grow up without her name being in there. Was that required? No, because there were things in there that accounted for an unborn child. However, she wanted her to be named just like the other girls were. She had to ask the court for permission to do that. Okay, so planning, absolutely, the intention was there to care for them, but sometimes leaving that gap leaves holes. Nipsey Hussle passed away without a last will and testament, although he had life insurance policies. The issue with that was he had two minor children, and he was not married to the mother of either of them. Nobody, I don't care who you are, nobody wants a 12-year-old getting $1 million life insurance policy. So that left, since he did not have a will, that left it open to, okay, well, those policies are going to pay out to those two minor children, but who is going to hold those funds for those children, and what is that going to look like? Again, unintentional on his part, clearly. However, it left holes. And so sometimes planning without making it a comprehensive plan can leave a worse scenario than nothing at all.
In that, like for Nipsey Hussle, that was such a quick fix of simply changing the beneficiary designation to a trust instead of to the children. And that trust would just have the funds paid to it. And then the trust would have language, manage it for such and such child until he or she gets to 18, 25, whatever. And it literally could have been something drafted in an office in a few hours, or a few days, depending how complicated they wanted to make it. But a lot of these things are not complicated to fix. Kobe Bryant, I think they would, after each child was born, I think they were going to actually
update
them formally. So if they did that before, have a mechanism in there. Okay, kids born on Sunday, hey, sometime that week, let's just go do this, right? So these things are not really that hard, but life gets in the way, procrastination, just on awareness. Okay, I have the policy. I think I did enough. So if you talk to that team attorney, CPA, insurance agent, financial advisor, everyone keeps looking at things. Someone will expose something. Something's missing here. Something's not right, or So I think you just want to have a lot of eyes on things,
right.
and just have things checked over.
Right. All right. So what happens with all this, and I know just by the nature of the fact that all of you are here tonight, you have an interest on being on the right side of legacy building when it comes to history. There's certain words in here that stand out to me other than history. Understanding. We have to have knowledge. That's why Keith and I do these workshops, because we perish for lack of knowledge. People, we got to take care of people. We want to help people. We want to change the past. We want to have things that make sense for us and our plans. No two plans look alike. I don't do cookie cutter estate planning because no two families look alike. You could have identical twins with seemingly identical lives, and their plans are going to be different depending on their assets, depending on what their individual goals are. So everyone should think about what you want your legacy to look like. Think about a puzzle. If somebody were to take all of the pieces of your life and put them in a box and have that box readily available for somebody to put the puzzle together, you'd certainly want to leave them a picture rather than a cardboard box with no picture that they would never be able to figure out what it's supposed to look like. So estate planning is your opportunity to put that puzzle picture together for your loved ones in the event of incapacity and upon death. So any other questions? I know you all have been a fantastic audience for us this evening. You've asked some great questions as we went along, but want to give anyone that has any more questions an opportunity to ask those questions. I'm not seeing anything coming in the chat window.
Oh, pop up. Talking in the bean. What about property in another state that is not real property, but co-op shares?
Co-op shares as in like cooperative living where it's not joint property, but it's a co-op?
In New York, we have co-ops.
Yeah, I was about to say New York is the only place that I know of that has those. And
yeah,
I am not familiar with that.
Yeah, condos are real estate where you pass them by deeds.
Right.
Co-op, I'm not sure how those pass. If they're treated as personal property, then that's going to be part of your probate estate, and that we would have to pass. I'm not sure, some kind of memorandum. I'm not exactly sure how they would pass, but if they were in another state, personal property should be able to pass through your home state. So if I had personal property in Texas and I'm passed away in Georgia, and my probate's in Georgia, the personal property should be able to be handled with my Georgia estate. But if it's actually real estate like a condo, I have to do an ancillary probate and go to the other state where the real estate is and do a separate probate. So it kind of turns on whether that's considered real property or personal, and I'm not sure what a co-op is.
Yeah, I don't know much about it. All I know is that they exist in New York, and that's the extent of my knowledge when it comes to co-ops.
Yeah, I'm really from the New York and a New York bar, but I didn't do real estate, so I don't know how they treat it. The question is, can you transfer them in trust if there is debt? We have a rule, St. Germain Act, that if you move real estate that's your residence into a trust, it doesn't trigger the mortgage, it doesn't accelerate the mortgage. So I'm thinking you can move the property into a trust, but that debt's going to stay with that property. So the debt's not going to go away, but you can put it into the trust and just, have the trustee pay the mortgage on it, but it's definitely not going to go away.
Right, and that applies not just to co-ops that we're talking about. This is to any property where there is a deed associated with it. If you transfer property via deed into a trust, now the trust owns it, the deed changes. That does not change the mortgage. So even though a trust owns that property, if the mortgage is not paid, it's going to be foreclosed on just like any other property. So when you set up that trust, you should also set up a mechanism to pay off any remaining balance on a mortgage, or whoever you want to assume that property also assumes the debt. Otherwise, like I was saying, you risk it still being foreclosed on because the deed itself is separate from the mortgage or the debt attached to that property.
And this is kind of like to kind of tie it in. We mentioned like the life insurance being paid to a trust. If you wanted to leave a house to a minor, you may move the house into the trust, but have the life insurance payable to the trustee at your death. That way the trustee has some funds. Okay, now the trustee has $1 million or whatever to actually keep paying, on that property. So you want to definitely coordinate, and that's part of what estate planning is with building a legacy. You have to coordinate all the different pieces, and that's why you really need to sit down with your professionals and think through all the different steps. Okay, I'm going to leave this person custody of my child. Oh, okay, you know what? I might need to leave them money to take care of that child. And, you know, I don't want to just appoint a minor guardian and give them a child to feed without giving them money to go along with it. So you got to kind of coordinate all these things, or property,
Right.
or whatever.
Right. That's right. All right. Any other questions this evening for either of us? All right. Well, I would like to thank all of you for joining us this evening. Again, this has been Keith Miles and Shannon Wilson presenting via ICABA Live. The information that we presented tonight was about estate planning and looking at it from a Black history perspective. Join us again the third Tuesday of March. Can't believe we're almost in March, where we're going to be covering air property. The third Tuesday of April, we will be covering special needs planning considerations when it comes to estate planning. Feel free to reach out to either one of us. Our contact information is on the screen. You can also find both of us within the ICABA Live, the ICABA World Community Mastermind Group. We are both the facilitators on the Estate Planning Mastermind Group. And if you have no further questions, there's one more question in here about a co-op. If it is inherited, the co-op and will be between daughter and broker of deceased. I'm not quite sure what that means. If it is inherited. Oh, daughter and brother of the, if it is inherited.
Not, so if the co-op passes through is it passing through a will? And it says to some siblings?
To the daughter and brother of the deceased.
Yeah, I think it still comes back to whether it's personal property or real property. If it's real property in another state, you're going to have to do a probate in that other state in order to pass it to whomever it's going to. Because if state of Georgia can't do probate on another state's property, if it's in a state, you know, property's in Ohio, you got to go to the Ohio court and ask them to actually leave that property to the daughter and brother. So if it's real property, you're going to have to actually go to another jurisdiction. If it's personal property, I think you'd be okay to just go through the regular probate and pass it through the state of Georgia.
Right, and that goes for any two states. The probate action takes place where the person passes away. Some states will allow you to open what's called an ancillary petition in the other state just to take care of. It's not a full-blown probate, it's just for that property in that state. So, and it varies. Real property, for instance, here in Georgia, you don't have to open an ancillary petition if the person died elsewhere with property here in Georgia, depending on how that property was titled. So you have to know the ins and outs of the states involved in order to look at that. And it varies from state to state. Estate planning is very state specific.
Yeah, even if they didn't leave a will, if they left the will, you just be an executor of the estate. If they didn't leave a will, you'd be an administrator of the estate. But the same principle of whether it's real estate or personal property still applies. So not leaving a will doesn't change whether or not you have to go through the estate administration. It just basically means that there's no will directing you where things go, and you fall back on New York statute, their intestate statute that just says these people get the property, but transferring the property is going to depend on whether it's real estate or personal property.
Correct.
You're welcome.
All right. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. Again, feel free to join us again the third Tuesday of March when we're going to talk about air property. And if there are no further questions, we're going to let you all go this evening. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Have a good night. Thank you, Shannon.
Thanks, Keith. It's been great again.
Absolutely. See you in number 8 next month.
Sounds good. Looks like there's something in the chat window. Are you still recording? Oh, you just stopped it.
Yes, absolutely recording. Okay.
Are people still in our room? Or did you end it for
There are
everybody?
5 participants still here.
Okay.
3 participants. But I think we can end it.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, perfect.